being opposed by a different community that may or may not want what that community is doing. Whereas if a Bill of Rights is giving the right of that individual citizen, looking at it as a population as a whole, that actually ends up strengthening the diversity element, and through that diversity, the community element. Is that the essence of how you see the Bill of Rights having had one of the effects on people in the structure?
And at the time of its preparation, in the times of the debate, the discussion was to find how do you articulate rights without limiting their scope, but without eliminating prospects for what natural rights and civil rights ought to be. We have a civil right, the right to life, but we have civil rights and the right to jury, speedy trials, and such, which enable natural rights to be protected. So we institute civil rights to protect natural rights. How do you frame a Bill of Rights that it may incorporate a view of what the role of a citizen is amongst other citizens? Because the protection of one citizen is the protection of all citizens. And if it's left to be inferred, as Mr. Jefferson was so inclined to say, we should not infer these rights, they should be stated outright. The preparation of a Bill of Rights is an act by which a segment of the society articulates rights which may be construed equally amongst the whole population. It may again not be the practice, but it is the principle. And after a while, the paper parchment itself, a Bill of Rights, has no authority along with it. It's generally governed by violent, either political or military or belligerent activities, where the majority seeks to impose its will on the minority. A Bill of Rights institutes an equality, a political equality amongst all the people. And it can be construed in such a way that each individual can look upon a stated right as something, yes, that applies to me. And I realize it applies to my neighbor. And I realize that the right is inherent, but it doesn't extend so far that my right supersedes his right. And the articulation of these kinds of an idea in a way in which all the component elements of the society can view it as protection for themselves against the actions of others, or the protection of the minority from the abuses of a stable majority. These are the functions of a stated Bill of Rights. They have their role. In this country, it's had a role to inculcate, like you say, in the minds of the people, that these rights exist. They may be verily and summarily superseded. We had the Alien Sedition Rights in 1798. These Alien Sedition Acts that were proposed under the Federalist legislature in 1798 was an effort to suppress free press, find individuals for calling the president, Mr. Adams, perhaps his rotunda, insults to him personally. And the Alien Sedition Acts indicated that any abuse of policy or personal abuse of individuals would be construed as sedition. And they could be fined and imprisoned, and many were fined and many were imprisoned during that time. And it was instituted and proposed actually by Mr. Adams' wife, Mrs. Adams. Mr. Adams had it proposed in the legislature, in the Congress, in the House of Representatives, the Senate, which were both Federalist members, the majority of Federalist members. The High Court, which was extant at the time, were appointed by High Federalists. So the court itself, the Supreme Court, consisted mostly of High Federalists. The Congress, the House of Representatives and Senate, mostly governed by a Federalist majority. And the presidency was in the hands of the Federalists. Now, if the three branches of government, which are supposed to inherently have checks upon one another, and yet all three are in the act of abridging the Constitution, particularly the First Amendment, by instituting these Alien Sedition Acts, where does the authority lie to countermand what they're doing? It's supposed to emanate from the people. What the people's representatives create a majority which is abusive against the minority. They imprison individuals, they fine individuals very severely. And so we prepared resolutions in Virginia and in Kentucky to state the state's objections to the Federalist actions. as being unconstitutional. Not being unfair to Virginia, not being unfair to Kentucky, not being unfair to North Carolina. It was actually introduced, the Kentucky resolutions actually introduced first in North Carolina. But rather an affront to the whole people. And the legislature should get together and bring their objections to the national government for acting in an unconstitutional fashion. Who declares something unconstitutional if the three branches say it's constitutional? And there's an abuse, basically, of the authority of the majority. It never came to the Supreme Court, a decision. So the Supreme Court, as the third branch, was never tested. But the executive branch and the congressional branch both conspired to abridge the rights of men. And they did so under the guise that a crisis arose in which they had to supersede the Bill of Rights. They had to supersede the right of free press and right of free speech because the crisis was so great. We were at war with the French. Bills of Rights are instituted for those very moments of crisis. They are to institute and inculcate in the people the fact that these rights exist, even though there's an attempt to abridge them. And by so articulating these rights, the reports of 1800, the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions appeal to that sense of the freedom of free speech, that the Bill of Rights. The whole matter was suspended with the death of Washington in 1799 and the ending of the Alien Sedition Acts. They expired on the 4th of March in 1801. So the issue was presented but never really resolved. But it was a clear indication of all the salutary things we may say about the Republican experience and the American experience, that there was a direct challenge by three branches of government to these rights. And it's at that moment those rights should be clearly stated. The theses of Martin Luther on the door, these are when the rights have to be declared. They are not rights to be suspended in times of crisis. They don't apply in times of peace. There's no need for Bill of Rights in times of peace, at least if matters are peaceful amongst the people. But when the abuses come from a majority, that's when Declaration of Rights really begins to take hold and to have an import amongst the people. Generally, it also enables the courts, incidentally, to apply to the Bill of Rights in issues where no other...
You said something really fascinating, which is, in reality, it is a hedge against potential crises to come, because some of the opponents of a Bill of Rights in Lebanon will say, you know, before we even start talking about amending or introducing a Bill of Rights, let's implement the Constitution, which has yet to be implemented. And of course, the counter-argument to this is it's not being implemented because of the abuses that the Constitution itself has presented. So it's almost like a circular argument that can only be resolved through a kind of a retention by the people, asking for their rights back and stating to all branches of government, we gave you that power, now we want some of it back, be it you know, power in terms of, you know, voting rights or socioeconomic rights or even legal rights, judicial rights. So in a way, it's kind of following in those footsteps, but anticipating. And right now they are in a crisis. In Lebanon, you know, we happen to be in a crisis, unfortunately. But it anticipates other crises that may arise. And so the Bill of Rights is there as a protection to the citizen. And I really liked how you described it as a form of a social kind of social contract hedge to potentialities in the future.
It's not something that people will abrogate. Rights in a Republican form of government are extant, whether or not anyone wants to recognize them. They are there. They're established by nature. Nature's God. They are inherent with the right of any individual born into society. Those individuals may waive those rights for a period of time, suspend them, or even fail to acknowledge them. But the rights are there, whether people want to articulate them or not. They're always there. That is the nature of mankind governing himself. And so when they argued in the House of Representatives, Mr. Sherman spoke up, why should we talk about a Bill of Rights? We don't need a Bill of Rights. We don't even have a Constitution that's been tested yet. Why should we make amendments to it? Others objecting that, we have other important things to deal with. We've got commerce to deal with. We have imports to be done this spring in 1789. Why should we waste our time talking about amendments that aren't really going to please anybody? They're not going to do anything. It's a tub to the whale. It's diverting people's attentions for wanting amendments and putting in something meek as a substitute for it. The objections ranged across quite a spectrum, but the nature of the objections were still there no matter what form they took. They were very strong objections to having created the union, and since they created it, they don't want to appeal to the people who didn't like it because they're already in power. The majority is there, and we're running a constitution which is efficacious. And this idea of appealing to those who were dissatisfied because the Constitution ratified and they didn't like it because it didn't have the Bill of Rights, they don't count in the worst case scenario. So the idea that when you say that people gave rights to the government and now want them back, we would not frame it that way. We would say the rights were always there. We may have given them up a little bit. We don't want them back. We want them really to be re-acknowledged as having been there the whole time, and we just suspended them for a bit.
And that's interesting. There's a couple more points I'd like us to touch on, which is the structure of the Bill of Rights. There was a lot of debate at the time in terms of the Bill of Rights being interlaced or included as part of the Constitution. And indeed, you yourself were pushing for that. But others actually said, no, we'd like it to be...
Mr. Sherman, particularly from
Mr.
Connecticut.
Sherman from Connecticut, particularly, preferred for it to be a document in and of its own right, but of course on par with the rest of the Constitution. Now that you've had a few years to contemplate on that, do you think the fact that it is an independent document makes it something that is associated more with the people, that the people feel that